Good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute for Energy Law's webinar, Wellhead to Plastic Bag, a technical and operational view of the oil and gas industry. I'm Vicki Adams, the Deputy Director of the Institute. I want to thank IEL's Young Energy Professionals Committee for working to put this program together. This is the third in a three-part summer webinar series designed for law students. If you missed the first session in this series covering the field, a discussion with energy lawyers in different disciplines, it's available on our YouTube channel. In addition, I would like to thank IEL's online learning sponsor, BakerBots. Through their generous support, we can make this program available for free to law students, our members, and many of their employees. This program will last for 60 minutes. As this series is geared toward law students, we have not requested MCLE credit. Today's speakers are Timothy Deutsch, Amy Kalt, and Luis Ray. Tim is a consultant with Baker & O'Brien Incorporated in the Dallas office. He offers experience in refinery engineering, operations, economics, and planning. His chemical plant experience includes process safety management, capital projects, operations, and technology support of soybean and vegetable oil processing. Amy Kalt is a consultant and manager of analytical services in the Houston office of Baker & O'Brien. She's been with them since March 2009, and she advises refining, midstream, and marketing clients on a broad range of issues, including business strategy, asset and business valuation, crude oil and refined product markets and logistics, acquisition and divestitures, and competitive market positioning. In addition to the industry advisory services, Amy supports legal disputes related to asset valuation, tax appraisals, business interruption losses, and commercial contract disputes. Luis Ray is a consultant in the Houston office of Baker & O'Brien. Luis offers more than 30 years of experience in the oil and gas industry in technical and executive roles, where he has been responsible for project management, enterprise and project risk management, project engineering, and the structural design of offshore facilities. He's managed upstream and downstream engineering, procurement, and construction activities for projects in the US, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific. At this time, I'll turn it over to your presenters to get us started.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm going to be starting the presentation and going over some of the basics, a little bit about us, some of the fundamentals that you should know. And then I'll be followed by Luis, who will cover upstream for us. You'll come back to me to cover the midstream, and then we'll switch over to Tim to cover the downstream. So next slide, Luis. I will let you guys read this at your leisure whenever you have a recording of this on your YouTube channel. Next slide. So just a little bit about who we are. So as Vicki was mentioning, we're all from Baker & O'Brien. We are an independent consulting firm with a lot of background in the energy sector. So most of our consultants have had long careers with refiners, with upstream, with producers, with engineering companies. And so we get engaged a lot of times by law firms whenever they're looking for that technical expertise on why is somebody suing somebody else? Was there a technical issue that happened? Help us understand the problem and help us provide advice to people as the project goes on. So as you guys all continue your career in the law sector, you'll probably be encountering a variety of different experts, such as companies like us. So next slide, Luis. So as we mentioned, we're going to cover the upstream, midstream, and downstream sector. The upstream sector is exploration and production. So that would be getting the crude oil and natural gas out of the ground. Luis will be covering a lot more on the specifics of that area. Then we'll move to midstream, where we'll cover the transportation, storage, and processing. So this would be getting that oil and gas to the next point along the value chain, whether that be a refinery or a processing station, or even a retail center for gasoline and diesel. And then finally, we'll move into the downstream that Tim will cover, where we'll cover refineries as well as petrochemical facilities, so we can kind of end up at that plastic bag according to our title. So first, a couple of fundamentals. Next slide, Luis. Oil and gas obviously comes from way down deep under the ground. So it's made from decomposing organic waste, and this takes 300 or 400 million years to form oil and gas. As that organic waste was buried way under the ground, mud gets on top of it, you get a lot of heat and pressure, it decomposes that organic waste, turns it into oil and gas. And that gets us to present time where you have an oil rig drilling down into the ground or even maybe sideways into the ground to start recovering some of that oil and gas. And typically where you find oil and gas, you're also going to find water. So you'll see the three phases there of different materials. Next slide, Luis. A couple things that are important to remember is that not all oil is the same. So people think about the oil industry, but the oil itself comes with a variety of different quality components to it. So within oil, you'll have a variety of different compounds such as methane, ethane, propane, and don't worry, we're not going to quiz you on any of those compounds on the left-hand side. Within crude oil, you'll have a variety of densities and viscosities. So that's where you get into the names of light crude versus heavy crude. You also have, every crude oil has some sulfur in it, and so that amount of sulfur can give you the name sweet crude or sour crude. So if you think about in the US, a lot of what has happened over the last decade has been an increase in the production of light tight oil or shale oil. And that type of crude is generally light crude that is sweet, so light sweet crude oil. A lot of what we've heard about up in Canada with the increased production up there is actually a heavy sour crude oil, and that's just how they're termed. The next slide, Luis, will cover gas. Similar to oil, not all the same. So lean gas would be mostly methane with some ethane, propane, and butanes and heaviers in it. And then rich gas would be, again, mostly methane, but it'll have a higher component of those NGLs, which are the ethane, propane, butanes, and heavier. And so these are just important things to remember as you're learning about oil and gas and you're trying to understand when somebody says, I'm producing light sweet crude oil, it means that it's a light crude that is low in sulfur, or I'm producing a rich gas, which means I have a higher component of NGLs within my natural gas stream. Next slide. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Luis.
Thank you, Amy. And good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank the Institute for Energy Law and Vicky and her team for inviting us to present today. One of the very first things that you will learn in the oil and gas industry is that it is very diverse. It expands into too many countries, and therefore you have different backgrounds, different cultures, different languages. So thus, in order for you to become familiar with this fact, I promise I'm going to put a very strong Spanish accent during the presentation, so that you will start getting familiar once in the future you get clients from different parts of the world. So although the theme of the presentation is from wellhead to a plastic bag, many other things happen before you can get into the wellhead. And these activities are called or are within the exploration and production phase, or sometimes called upstream. So exploration and production is or can be described like a series of logical sequence activities that goes from geological surveys, drilling up to completion or abandonment of a well, and then you start producing the well if you decide to explore. It involves a lot of people, a lot of contractors, engineers, lawyers, scientists, geophysicists. It's a very diverse industry, and it requires a lot of specialties in the different fields of expertise. So let's dive into geological surveys, or sometimes also geophysical surveys. And these are used to increase the chance of finding hydrocarbons. As Amy mentioned, you know, the geologists that know well oil and gas, they know that there are gonna be encounter in forms of layers. So they look for layers in the earth. And for example, on the left side, you can see a 3D geophysical image, and it represents what is called the stratum, which is a series of layers of rocks in the ground. Also, you can perform what is called geophysical or seismic surveys. You can do it on land, or you can do it on the seabed. In the land, seismic survey is produced by a human-generated wave that is sent through the earth using a thumper track. The more energy in the wave, the farther it's gonna go before it starts dissipating. So several things could happen here depending on the properties of the rock. The wave can either pass through, can be reflected, or some combination of the two. And then when the wave gets back, it gets collected by devices called geophones. And the geophones are gonna measure the time since the wave was sent till the wave was got back, and also, you know, the strength of that wave coming back. The same happens with subsea, with the difference that you use sound waves to map the geological structures that are under the seabed. And these sound waves, you know, they travel through the water and they can penetrate up to 6,000 meters below the sea level. And then the waves, when they come back, the sound waves, when they come back, they are recorded in devices called hydrophones as compared to the ones used for land, which are geophones. Once all this geological surface has been studied and well understood, then a decision is made that we are going to test a well. We are going to go and drill. But before you do that, you need to have the right permits for doing it. In most of the countries of the world, all the minerals, resources belong to the government. The rocks, the minerals, and of course, the oil and gas. And if somebody or some entity or corporation would like to extract those, they would like to get permits from the governments where they found the minerals. In the US, is one of the few places in the world where the minerals can be owned by individuals or businesses. And if it belongs to the government, you can lease those minerals, those fields actually, different range of depths and different durations, limitations, etc. Another thing is the surface rights. Let's assume that somebody goes to your door on your property and says, I will pay you $100 million for the oil that is beneath your property. That would be great, right? However, you do not know how to extract it. You do not have the capability. You do not have the resources. It will cost a lot of money. So what you do is you sell the rocks and the oil and gas in your property, but you reserve your surface rights. And also you can get compensation for ingressing or egressing the property, for the building of the roads, the rights of ways, and if there is some damage to your property, you get compensated. So if you would like to sell it, you sell it, but you remain possession or maintain possession and control of the surface. Let's dive now into the core of exploration and production, which is the mud drilling. And mud drilling is one of the main methods for well drilling. Basically, you drill, and then you pump fluid down the drill pipe, which is called the Kelly. That's the vertical pipe in the picture. And then through, once you are drilling, then the fluid start pushing up all of the cuttings, and then you collect all of the cuttings in what is called the mud pit. Then using a suction hose, the mud is pumped back into the Kelly, and then drill pipes continue to be attached as you go deeper and deeper. Once you do that, at certain intervals, the drill string is taken out, and then the well bore is lined with pipe casing and it is cemented. And you all this just to maintain the stability of the well and also to avoid contamination of the groundwater that is surrounding that well. Another piece of important equipment in the drilling process is called the blowout preventer, or the BOP. And basically works like a series of valves to close a well in case of an emergency. It is located at the top of the wellhead. And when there is an emergency, like what they call a kick, then the BOP automatically closes hydraulic rams by activating seals against the drill string to seal the bore. But sometimes there is malfunction on that, and you will be forced to cut the drill string. So then you will have another device that will cut the drill string and will seal properly the well. typically a BOP has like 6 different types of shutdown mechanisms that they interact each other after one of the other one fails. Probably you have heard the famous BP Deepwater Horizon incident that happened in 2010. It was a field that belonged to BP. It was called the Macondo field. And what it was discovered after investigations was that it was a massive failure of the BOP in sequence. Everything started failing, and then they couldn't contain the oil, and then just start spilling. And Baker O'Brien was heavily involved in those investigations. When I look at this slide, I really got very excited because what you see in here is engineering at its best. And I got excited because through years, I have seen how the industry has really been challenged with going into deeper water depths. And this is an illustration of how the industry with respect to drilling rigs and production facilities have been expanding and has been growing. Number 1 and number 2, for example, were the conventional fixed platforms. They could go up to 1,500 feet of water depth. And then they realized they need to go deeper. So they come up with the concept of a compliant tower, which is number 3, which is a very slender piece of structure that oscillates with the wave motions. They could go up to sometimes to 3,000 feet. Then they want to go deeper, and then they develop what is called the tension leg platforms, or the TLPs, which are structures that float, that are vertically moored to the seabed, and they can go up to 4,000 feet. And then they decided to go up to 8,000 feet, and they developed a concept called the spar, which is number 6. As a matter of fact, Shell has the deepest spar in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Perdido field. Probably you have heard about that, or you will hear about that. But it's a very elegant piece of production drill in the Gulf of Mexico. There is some people that decided to go even deeper, up to 20,000 feet. And then you got the semi-subs, which are number 7 and number 8. And you also have the famous floating production, storage, and offloading tankers, which is number 9, that you know, they float, they produce, they store, and then they move the oil back to the tankers. So a lot of good technical development in here. So once the drilling continues, actually when the drilling continues, then you have to make sure that whatever your assumptions were during the surveys are proved. And that's what is called logging and testing. So well logging is the practice of making a detailed record of the well. And then you throw a wire line through the pipe, through the drilling pipe, with a lot of instruments and sensors. And what you do is you just capture the resistivity, porosity, what the minerals are, the saturation, etc., with those sensors, in order to make the decision if you're going to continue drilling and if you are going to spend a lot of money in putting together a production facility on top of that well. And that leads to well completion. And I talked a little bit about production casing and cementing on the previous slides, but then the last step is perforating, where you actually perforate the casing and the cement in order to allow the oil and the gas enter into the well stream. The last step before production begins is the installation of the Christmas tree. That's what the industry calls it. And it's a piece of equipment that provides basically flow control on an oil and gas well. So when the oil has been decided to move it into production, the BOP is removed, and then they place the Christmas trees. It's basically a vertically assembly of valves. It's got gauges, chokes, and then also it allows you to inject some chemicals while you are producing or extracting the oil. When it comes to production, is a very looks like a very simple process, but itself is complicated. But basically what you do is you just separate the oil from the water and also the gas. So each one will have its own stream, and then you either store the oil or transport it, and you will do the same with the gas. You either compress the gas in order to send it and transport it. And then you either treat the water before disposal, or you just store the water and then move it somewhere else. This is an example of a production facility. In this case, once the wells, not only one, but several wells have been decided to get exploited, then what you see in here is a typical shallow water production platform. You will see on the left corner, the farthest to the left, it's the drilling rig, and it has several wells in there. And then the oil is pumped back into the production platform, which is the one in the middle. And then you have two other platforms which basically compress the gas that has been separated from the previous one, and it transported through pipelines. You will also see on the top right side a living quarters platform, because people live in those platforms, in those facilities. So they need to have rooms and dining rooms and things to rest and distract themselves. In case of emergency, you will see those towers on the left. Those are flare towers. So what you do is, if you need to relieve the pressure, you open the valve and you just start flaring the gas. On the other side of the spectrum, you have a subsea production system. This is in water depths of 8,000, 20,000 feet, as I was showing before. And you can see a subsea production system with an FPSO, which is connected to subsea wells. And then the oil and the gas flows back to the FPSO through what is called the flow lines. The amazing thing with these type of facilities is that everything is performed remotely. Everything is controlled remotely. So all the power, the heat, the controls are through cables that are called umbilicals, and then they just go back to produces the oil, and then it goes back to the tanker. So that's all what I have. Hope you have enjoyed it, and I leave the podium again to Amy.
Okay, thank you, Luis. So with this section, we're going to start the midstream. So now we have oil and gas coming up out of the surface to the wellhead. From here, we need to get that material to its next point in the value chain. So we're going to go through the midstream. Next slide. So this slide takes you from the wellhead to the ultimate user on the right, which would be in green in the downstream sector. We're going to start on the left, and I'll just walk through the value chain, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics of each of these types of assets in the next couple slides. So starting on the left at the wellhead, first we'll start with natural gas. So whether you're producing crude oil or natural gas, you're going to have some assets that are very similar, like we're going to use pipelines, but the materials used to make those pipelines, the amount of pressure that they need to hold, and the facilities required after that can change. So let's start with natural gas. With natural gas, since it is, as the name says, a gas, it has to be compressed and held within a pipeline. And so everything along the value chain is held very tightly. It can't be put onto, for example, a truck unless it's a specialized truck. It can't be put onto a tanker unless it's a specialized tanker. So you need to have all sorts of pressurized materials used in the transport of the natural gas. From natural gas pipelines, you would go to a gas processing facility as one of your first steps. So the natural gas that comes out of the ground, a lot of times it has the natural gas component, and then it has natural gas liquids. It also comes with water and some other kind of unsavory actors that might be mixed in with the stream. So you go to that first step and you separate it out. And so you'll get your dry gas separated out into its own stream, and you'll get a mixed NGL stream, which is a liquid component of natural gas separated out into its stream. From there, you'll take your dry gas into some natural gas pipelines, perhaps over to storage, which are a lot of times in underground caverns, and ultimately onto the downstream user, which in the dry natural gas stream would either be like power plants. We have a lot of gas-fired power plants here in the US. We could go to LNG, which means that it's being exported to another country, or it could go into feedstock for refineries. There's a lot of different places you might be using that natural gas. Then NGL stream that came off of that gas processing facility is mixed. It's a mixed stream of ethane, propane, butane, condensates, things like that. So you'll go into an NGL pipeline, and from there you'll go to a fractionator, which separates. Fractionation is the same word as separates. It separates that stream into its individual components. From there, you might need to go to storage, or you'll be shipped along some specialized pipelines to wherever the next user would be. So in the case of ethane and propane, it might be going on to a petrochemical facility, or for propane, it could be going, into canisters for your backyard barbecues. In the case of butane, isobutane natural gasoline is probably going on to a refinery for blending into gasoline. Then on the crude oil side, so all the way back over on the wellhead, crude oil, since it's a liquid phase product, can be put into a truck, it can be put into a rail car, it can be put onto a tanker, usually doesn't require any sort of specialized pressurization or anything like that. But you'll use one of those types of assets to move it to potentially storage, but ultimately into a refinery, which Tim will talk about refining here in a little bit. Out of a refinery, though, you get refined products, which also need to be shipped by pipeline, truck, tanker, rail car to ultimate consumers. So from there, about 70% of what comes out of a refinery would be in the transportation fuel area. So you would be looking at going to a gas station, a diesel station, might be going to an airport if it's jet fuel. And then the other refined products would be sent on to their consumers, which maybe is marine fuels or asphalt for road construction, things like that. So next slide, Luis. So let's start with natural gas. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each of those facilities we just kind of quickly covered on the previous slide. Starting with pipelines, this would be the most common way to transport natural gas. Since it's a gas phase, you're actually going to start at the wellhead with a very small diameter pipeline. It'll go to a larger diameter pipeline as it gets into transmission. So you've picked up natural gas from a lot of different wellheads. You've brought it to a larger pipeline, and now you're going to put all of that gas together and ship it to the next facility. And then whenever you're ready to send it on to consumers for home heating or something like that, you'll have a smaller pipeline again. Now, interestingly, in the picture that we're showing on the left, it shows an above ground pipeline. That is very uncommon. Most pipelines are buried, so you wouldn't actually know that they're there unless you see signage that says there's a pipeline here. As of 2017, there were 318,000 miles of gathering and transmission lines and about 2.2 million miles of distribution pipelines. So there's pipelines kind of all over the country. Just don't really know they're there since they're buried underground. The next section would be gas plants. So I had mentioned that one of those first processing facilities that you would get to in the natural gas value chain would be a gas plant. This one it's a very pretty picture because it shows snow around it and something like that. So it's probably up in Colorado somewhere or something. But all this plant is doing is just separating out your NGLs from your dry gas. Both streams that are going to come off of that are going to go straight into a pipeline again. So these plants are located very close to the production. So if we're producing natural gas out in the Permian, so out in West Texas, you'll see a variety of gas plants, and we'll show a map of that here in a minute. The next step would be an NGL fractionator. So this is that NGL stream that came off of that gas plant, and it's going to be separated or fractionated into its various streams. Now, interestingly, here in the US, Mont Belvieu, Texas, which is just east of Houston area, is a major hub for NGLs. There's a lot of NGL fractionation that goes on in this area. There's big caverns for storage for the streams that come off of this. And it's located close to petrochemical manufacturing. So some of the streams go straight to the petrochemical plants, and there's also export facilities. So it's just a large complex with a variety of different companies participating, and it has just become one of the NGL hubs of the world. One of the other phases or one of the newer things that's going on in the US right now is LNG facilities and LNG tankers. In the US, we produce more natural gas than what is needed or what can reasonably access markets. And so the excess natural gas is exported. Now, since this is a gas phase, it takes a lot of specialized treatment. So what an LNG facility does is it cools that natural gas down to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit. When it does that, it hits a phase change and turns into a liquid. So the natural gas is now shrunk down quite a bit, and then you're turning it into a liquid. And this then gets pumped into a very specialized ship, what's shown in the picture here, which allows you to move that ship onto another place that is short natural gas. So In the US, we export LNG off to Asia, over to Europe. We export to a lot of different places. The last thing that's very important in the natural gas value chain would be storage. Natural gas is a very seasonal product. It's used quite a bit in the winter whenever you need home heating, and then it's used in the peak times in summer whenever you need the electricity manufacturing. So in those off seasons, you're still producing natural gas. The wellhead doesn't just turn off. So you need to put it somewhere. So what happens is natural gas is then stored in large underground caverns until it's needed later on. All right, next slide. This one is very similar to the previous one, but it's on crude oil instead. So again, we'll start with pipelines. Again, that rare above ground pipeline that we're seeing in the picture here. Again, crude oil pipelines are also typically buried, so you would not see them just kind of hanging out anywhere. You'll have a similar structure where you have small diameter gathering lines that go to a large trunk line, and then they'll go to smaller lines as they connect off to refineries. In 2017, there were 79,000 miles of crude oil pipelines and 62,000 miles of product pipeline, quite a bit less than what we saw on the natural gas side. And that's just because crude oil can be transported in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to necessarily go into a pipeline. So it gives you a little bit of variety on that. And then it doesn't have the pressurized components that you need for natural gas. Tankers and barges are used in crude oil and petroleum product transportation. This would either facilitate imports of crude oil or maybe exports of crude oil into and out of the US, since we're kind of focusing here. It would also facilitate movements of intermediate feedstocks. So like, let's say you've taken crude oil into a refinery and you've made something that's not quite finished. Another facility might need that stream. And so you can put it onto a barge or under a tanker and you can ship it off to another facility for further processing. And then let's say you created diesel or gasoline and it's not necessarily needed where you produced it. So you ship it off to somewhere else where they do need it. So you use a lot of tankers and barges. In the US, this would be true for natural gas too. If you're shipping from a US port to another US port, you're governed by the Jones Act restrictions, which says that it has to be a US manufactured ship and a US staffed ship. So it makes it a little bit more expensive to ship port to port in the US. We use rail cars for the transportation of crude oil and products, and it's kind of that stopgap measure that is utilized when there's not a pipeline or some other way of moving that material from point A to point B. This has become more common in the crude oil side as crude oil production took off more quickly than pipelines could be built. And so you saw a lot of rail car movements go on there. Tanker trucks are used for short distances. It's a very expensive mode of transport, but they are used if you're trying to do crude gathering, and then you're also looking at refined product delivery. So like you're trying to move your gasoline to the gas station, you would use a tanker truck in that situation. And then storage, big storage facilities. Now these a lot of times are above ground. There is some crude oil underground storage over in Louisiana and some other parts of the US. And then there's also a little bit of refined product underground storage. For the most part, you'll see above ground tanks. So these big white tanks that you see in the picture, you'll probably see them all around your different cities. They facilitate the storage of all the variety of different products that you might get out of a refinery, and they store crude oil. All right, next slide. So I'm going to walk quickly through a map. This just to kind of show where these assets are situated. So this first map just has where all the production is taking place in the US. So any brown dot on this map would be a oil well, and any blue dot would be a natural gas well. And then those big blue squares that are rectangles that I put on there would just name the location. So you can see the popular names of Permian over in West Texas, Eagle Ford down in South Texas, Bakken up in North Dakota. And what you can see here is a lot of that production is focused in the central part of the US. So next slide. Starting with natural gas, we're going to add on the natural gas plants. So I mentioned those are located basically where the production takes place. So that's where you see all those gas plants just layer right on top of the natural gas production. And then the next slide. Now we have a whole spider web of pipelines that go on, because I mentioned that natural gas needs that specialized transport. So you have to have pipelines involved. Any of the dark blue lines that you're seeing here would be natural gas pipelines, and the light blue, it's kind of hard to differentiate the color, would be an NGL line. So it makes a huge spider web all across the country, and you'll see big clusters of those dark blue lines in the production area, because those would be the gathering lines from a wellhead to that gas plant or to the transmission line. The next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we produce more natural gas than what we necessarily need here in the US, and so we export that. So you see those red triangles pop up, which are LNG export facilities. A couple of these are actually operating now that are mentioned as under construction. The slide's a little bit old, but those are the locations of the export facilities. All right, next slide. Now let's do the same thing for crude oil. So we're back to our map of where all the crude oil production is located. Next. Now we've added on refineries. So all those blue stars would be refineries. What you'll note here is that sometimes refineries are located where the oil is produced, and sometimes they're located where the consumers are. So if you look over on the West Coast, for example, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, you don't see a whole lot of crude oil production going on over there, but those are big population centers, and so they need a lot of the refined products. Similarly, over on the East Coast around Newark Harbor, Philadelphia area, you see several refineries over there, and yet there's no crude oil production. So instead, crude oil has to be transported to those refineries. And what I would note is on this chart, you'll see a huge cluster of stars that are all along the Gulf Coast. The US Gulf Coast holds about 50% of the refining capacity in the US. And so it's all situated down there between Corpus and New Orleans, basically. All right, next slide. Now we've added on the crude oil pipelines to get the crude oil to these refineries. The way oil flows from Canada and northern US is typically north to south. And so those pipelines are all generally moving from Canada or from the northern US towards the Gulf Coast. So important thing to note here is that we mentioned most of the production is in the central part of the US. So what you see though, is there are no crude oil pipelines that go over to the East Coast, to those refineries over in Newark Harbor and Philadelphia. There are also no crude oil pipelines that are going over to LA and San Francisco. That means that those refineries in those locations are relying on imports. They're not getting to participate in the huge increase in crude oil production that we've had here in the US. All right, next slide. Now what we've done here is just put on the product pipelines. We took the crude oil pipelines off, we put product pipelines on. So once you're at a refinery, your refinery might not necessarily be located in the place where you need to actually consume your gasoline and diesel. And so then you use these pipelines to transport it around the US. So what you can see from the Gulf Coast, for example, one of the largest pipelines, or the largest pipeline in the US, a refined product pipeline that goes from Houston all the way up to New York City, is called Colonial. That made the news earlier this year whenever there was a hack into their system and Colonial Pipeline shut down for over a week. You saw some fuel shortages show up along the East Coast, because if you notice between maybe Mississippi, Alabama area, all the way up to New York, there are no refineries in that area. So that entire region depends on Colonial and Plantation pipelines. So you started seeing fuel shortages showed up in Atlanta and Raleigh and Charlotte kind of areas. So those product pipelines are extremely important for deliveries of fuels to everyone. And if you are not using a pipeline, then sometimes you ship things by ship, and that's the dotted lines that show up here. So in the Gulf Coast, we export quite a bit of ULSD and gasoline. We also bring in some intermediate components, and then you'll see that happening over in the East Coast, quite a bit of imports, and then on the West Coast, imports and exports of products, depending on the type of product. All right, next slide. All right, over to Tim.
All right, thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. So at this point in the value chain, we now have crude oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids that have been delivered via the midstream to refineries and petchem plants for further processing. Next slide, Louise. So refineries and petrochemical facilities, they're alike in some ways and different in others, with the obvious difference being the feedstocks and products. Oil is the main input to a refinery, and most of its products, gasoline and jet fuel and diesel, are consumed for their energy content. Petrochemicals is a more precise operation, and lighter hydrocarbons are being used to produce petchem products where subtle differences in performance and characteristics require very high purity and exacting specifications for the products. Common themes between the both include high capital intensity. Both require very large upfront investments, very high feedstock costs relative to the percentage of the operating costs, and both compete for global markets and are highly regulated. Next. So as Luis has already alluded to, each marketed crude oil has unique properties. So the two most common properties are gravity, API gravity, and sulfur. API is another term for the specific gravity or density of the material. And sulfur is another critical property for processing the crude oil. Increased sulfur levels means higher processing costs to remove the contaminant. From a commercial perspective, knowing both a crude oil's API and sulfur already tells a lot about the crude oil's potential market value. So the chart at the right depicts various crude oil grades with the sulfur content on the bottom axis, the API gravity on the vertical axis, and the size of the bubble indicates the relative production volumes. And as noted, the value of the crude oil to refiners, and hence its market price, generally declines with higher sulfur and lower gravity. The depiction on the left presents a more visual hierarchy for value of crude oils. And although current market prices are a bit higher than shown on this slide, it nonetheless shows the relative value with generally lighter oils or higher gravity API being easier to process and more valuable. The one exception is that at some point, very light condensates actually decline in value per barrel due to the presence of less valuable lighter hydrocarbons. Next slide. So if we were to simply take the crude oil being produced and distill or boil it into their natural fractions of gasoline, diesel, and heavy fuel oil, we find that the naturally occurring yields don't necessarily match the market demand. So the inherent yields of three different types of crude oil are shown in the slide, including a light sweet, a medium sour, and a heavy sour. The barrels in the center represent the proportionate yields of these types of crude. This is in comparison to the market demand shown in the box on the right. Right away, you can see that there's fairly large mismatches depending on the type of crude oil. So for example, the biggest mismatch is at the heavy end of the barrel, the dark maroon section on the bottom, where most crude oil contains more heavy viscous oil than the market requires. And at the same time, there's not enough gasoline and diesel, shown by the lighter yellow and orange sectors. In other words, some type of conversion is required to convert the heavy molecules into lighter, cleaner transportation fuels. Next. All right, so how is that done? So in a very simplified sense, refining can be broken down into three types of steps. So the first step is a distillation step, and it's a similar concept to what we just discussed, where the crude oil is heated and distilled into separate boiling fractions or cuts, as they're commonly referred to. At this step, only heat is used. There's no catalyst or hydrogen or even very high pressures at this stage. In most refineries, this distillation step occurs in two different columns, which is depicted with a picture in the middle there. One operating at close to atmospheric pressure, and the second one, usually a shorter, fatter tower, operating under a vacuum to keep temperatures below a certain point that would lead to excess fouling. Next. The second step involves taking the intermediate streams and treating and processing in conversion units. So these conversion units typically include reactors, and they'll use higher temperatures, higher pressures, catalysts, and hydrogen. And step two is where most of the heavy work is done in the refinery in terms of breaking molecules, rearranging them, and removing impurities. And the result of step two is a number of different components that are able to be blended into finished products. And here we come to the final step. Step three is where these components are blended into saleable products using different recipes. So for example, the gasoline that you see at the pump is often a result of blending anywhere from 6 to 8 different components to achieve a certain octane specification or other key properties to deliver a finished product that you're familiar with at the final pump. So refineries overall, we've all seen them, we've driven by them. At night, they can be quite pretty, almost resembling mini cities. Sometimes during the day, not so much, but they require lots of land. They're very large facilities, oftentimes employing hundreds to sometimes thousands of personnel, depending on the size of the facility. They're continuous operations 24/7. The oil is always flowing and operators are controlling the processes. There's a high degree of automation within the process, but always requires plenty of human monitoring and sometimes intervention to keep the process on track. And again, most of the process is invisible. It's not like you can watch widgets on a production line. Nearly everything is contained safely within pipes and vessels and continuously flows through the equipment. Next. All right, so the last step is getting fuels to the consumer, and this requires transporting from the refinery to the fuel pump. And as Amy touched on, this is first done in typically with large or bulk transfers using pipelines and water vessels to distribute products close to end market terminals. And then from there at these terminal tanks, the last leg is the transport by truck to underground storage tanks at the retail site. And then the fuel blend you see at the pump denotes the refining company that stands behind the fuel, but sometimes it doesn't always indicate who actually owns the pump and store. And a lot of times there's relationships between third-party resellers and owners of the site and the fuel suppliers and refining companies supplying the fuels. And this takes us to the end of the supply chain for refining. And in the case of gasoline, be an example, delivered to your fuel tank at the retail station. So next we'll move on to petrochemicals. Next slide. So let's talk petrochemicals, and we'll start with a focus on ethylene plants. These are commonly called olefin plants or crackers. And ethylene plants generally process the lighter molecules, ethane, propane, and light petroleum naphthas, and transform them into chemical building blocks. Crackers are so named because they crack or convert feedstocks into olefins and aromatics, which are the building blocks for other chemicals. This is done in a two-step process. It usually uses furnaces and high temperatures to crack the molecules, followed by rapid cooling or quenching. The second step involves compression of the resultant gases, and followed by separation into high purity products, such as the ethylene, the propylene, butadiene, and other chemicals. Most of all of these plants are concentrated on the US Gulf Coast, where they have access to the feedstocks and refineries. Next. So at this stage of the value chain, we're focusing on ethylene and propylene, two of the chemical building blocks that form the basis for most of the plastics that are manufactured around the world. And the ethylene and propylene are colorless, odorless gases, somewhat similar to ethane and propane. They're very expensive to ship because they require high pressure or cryogenic storage requirements. Therefore, most petchem companies also produce plastic relens and pellets, and these can be easily stored and shipped. So what happens is ethylene and propylene are converted into the plastic products in two discrete steps. First, the petchem company uses a gas phase reaction along with a catalyst to combine these light molecules into longer chain polymers. And then they melt and extrude the polymer to make plastic pellets. And at this stage, the products are polyethylene and polypropylene, and they look very similar with similar molecular structures. Next. And the last step is to convert these plastic pellets into the usual products we're all familiar with. So this is typically done by separate companies, typically referred to as converters, who take the plastic pellets and melt them and then convert them into the finished products, typically at different locations. And so these pellets are stored in bags and shipped via truck, rail, or ship to the converters. And a lot of these folks are not typically household names, but the finished products are become what we're all familiar with and use in our everyday lives. Next. All right, so lastly here we're showing some different classes of polymers, three classes of polyethylene on the left and the polypropylene on the far right. And you may be familiar, recognize the recycle symbols near the top. And so these chemicals go into a wide range of plastic products, and it all depends on what the criteria or properties are for the plastics. Do they need to be flexible or rigid, thick or thin, how strong, and that determines which chemicals are used and how they're made. And there's some overlap and competition between the products, say, for example, between polypropylene and polyethylene. So here we conclude the value chain, arriving at the plastic bag, again, and a whole host of other products, having been produced from ethylene, which were produced by crackers using feedstocks by gas plants and refineries. And so at this time, I'll turn the presentation back over.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through some kind of fun facts or maybe industry lore, just fun things, I guess, that you can tell other people if you're ever wanting to talk about the oil and gas industry. So let's start with the first one, the green triangle on the left. So the basis for the word petroleum is from the Latin. So Luis, go ahead, which is petra for rock and oleum for oil. So petroleum, as we talked about at the very beginning in our fundamentals, oil and gas is typically found way underground, underneath rocks, and it's long decaying organic matter. So there you go, petroleum. The next one is Vaseline, which is actually a petroleum product. So go ahead, Luis. Vaseline or petroleum jelly was invented a long time ago to help treat cuts and bruises. And one of the more kind of disgusting qualities of it is at one point it was actually used in place of lard or butter by some bakers. And I'm just surprised we were eating petroleum at one point. That's Vaseline. The next one, it talks about why we use a barrel of oil. So a barrel is 42 gallons, which is a very odd quantity. And so officially the industry adopted the barrel sizing back in 1872 at the Petroleum Producers Association. They said it was going to be officially 42 gallons. There is a quote out there that says it's about 300 pounds or as much as a man could wrestle. There's also some other ideas on why it became officially 42 gallons. Back in the 1800s, whenever we first started producing oil in the US in larger quantities, we were storing the oil in all sorts of different kind of containers, small containers, whiskey barrels, things like that. And whiskey barrels had generally become the size of about 40 gallons. And so they would say, well, let's put it in a 40-gallon container and we'll give you 2 gallons extra as like a gift to you, potentially for loss or something like that. So anyway, I don't know that there's exactly a true statement on why it's precisely 42 gallons, but a lot of it seems to have to do with the whiskey industry. The next one is the football that's shown down on the bottom left. And that's just because one of the most popular awards out there, the Heisman Trophy, was named after a Cooper's son in Titusville in 1880. So Titusville being the location of one of the first major oil producing wells here in the US. So yes, it was named after him. The next phrase, some of the more senior people in our company have heard the phrase cash on the barrel head. I had actually never heard this phrase, but anyway, so it's a term that originated in the oil field in the 1860s when supposedly Major Adams, who was a manager of the Clat farm near Oil City, Pennsylvania, sold his first 1,000 barrels of oil for cash. So according to the story, he kicked the nearest oak barrel upright and counted the $10,000 on the barrel head. And that became cash on the barrel head. I had personally never heard that phrase. And the last one is for good old Maybelline. So it's showing a picture of mascara. So go ahead, Luis. And this is in the 1910s, Mabel Williams created mascara by mixing lamp black, which is just the soot from lamp oil, with Vaseline, what we had talked about, the petroleum jelly up in the second square up there, to create mascara. And that was applied to women's eyelashes. Mabel Williams, she evolved that into a company, which became Maybelline. So good to know you're putting some petroleum products on your eyelashes, ladies. So with that, we'll turn over to questions. I'm not sure if any have come in, but we would love to answer any Q&A that's out there.
So what exactly is carbon capture and storage?
Sure, so that's becoming very popular in today's world because there are a lot of companies and as well as the Paris Climate Agreement that have come around to say we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as an industry. So one of the largest greenhouse gases that's out there is CO2. And so with CO2, what they're doing is they're capturing the CO2, which would typically be, I guess, sent off out of an industrial facility. They capture it, they put it into a pipeline. They take it over to a large storage facility, which is usually a big underground geological formation, and they pump the CO2 back down in the ground permanently. So it never comes into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas.
Okay, and I've got one for Tim. Can you give some case study examples of legal work Baker and O'Brien has supported in the refining and petrochemical space?
Sure, yes, I'm glad to, thank you. So I think Amy did a good job summarizing early on in the presentation, and we actually have a couple supplemental slides, I think, Luis, if you're willing to jump down the slide deck, if we still have those available. Slide 69, I believe, summary. So this just gives a high level overview. The depiction shows kind of how interconnected the industry is. And some of the high level summary of what Baker and Bryan does is summarized on the left, some of the litigation, arbitration support, export services that Baker and O'Brien provides. And EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction is one big area providing expertise in large mega projects, international projects on contracts and construction and dispute work there. Property damage and business interruption insurance claims are a big thing we do as well, providing expertise on the markets and business interruption. Asset valuations is another good example. Accident incident investigations. So there's, when something goes wrong, we provide expertise, whether it be on safety, operations, maintenance of facilities, that sort of thing, as well as commercial contracts and standard of care. So pretty wide variety of expertise we offer in the industry.
All right, Luis, can you talk about the difference between conventional and unconventional oil?
Yeah, sure. Well, it depends where the oil is. If it is easy accessible, like it is between the layers of the stratum that I just mentioned, and you just drill vertically with the mud drilling technique, is basically called conventional. So it's not that the oil is conventional or unconventional, it's the way you are going to extract the oil. So it is conventional oil if you use conventional methods like the mud drilling. If you have to drill and you have to actually go horizontally, and because the oil is trapped between layers that have no porosity or zero permeability, then you will have to crack those rocks, and then you will have to drill horizontally. That becomes non-conventional oil. The oil is the same, it's just the way how you extract them.
All right. Well, I think we have about 1 minute left, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up. I want to say a special thank you to Tim, Amy, and Luis for a wonderful discussion. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks for your attendance. If you would like more information about the Institute for Energy Law or our upcoming programs, you may go to our website at www.cailaw.org/IEL. Follow our company page on LinkedIn or reach out to me at vadams@cailaw.org. Thanks and have a great day.